Welcome in, and thanks so much for joining me. In today's episode, I'm going to continue in a series on the well-known Tibetan Buddhist text, The Three Principal Aspects of the Path. This is a text written by the famous scholar, practitioner, saint, Lama Tsongkhapa or Tsongkhapa. And this text has been really pivotal in my life and in my practice, and not only digesting the entirety of the Mahayana path, or attempting that, I guess, is more the way to say it, but also in condensing it and understanding how to practice its essential points. So its essential points really come down to these three principles of renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness, or non-dual wisdom. And Lama Tsongkhapa wrote this text. It's technically called the Lam Rim text, which means a text that goes in stages, a graduated stages of the path text. And this is one of his shorter texts. There's ones that are much longer that go into a lot of detail. But if we've studied some of those, or if we're just kind of curious, this shorter text is quite pithy and quite complete, and really helpful if we want to practice in a more complete way, or understand the entire path in a complete way. So in the previous episodes, we went into some history of this text, a little bit on Tsongkhapa, as well as went into the verses on renunciation mind. So just to recap a little bit, renunciation mind, or renunciation, is the first principle of the path, because without it, we don't really know why we're meditating, and we don't necessarily have a motivation that's going to take us to a destination that brings full freedom, right? Of course, at whatever level we are, or whatever, kind of practice we want to do, meditation will help us. There's no doubt about that, as long as we know how to navigate it. But on the Buddhist path, there's a lot of energy and understanding and clarity put into why are we doing this, and what are we trying to attain? And in the beginning, that can feel a little bit lofty or confusing. But as we progress in our understanding of the path, we start to understand how vital renunciation is, which basically is developing a type of exhaustion for the ways we conduct ourselves through body, speech, and mind that are causing harm, that are causing suffering. And then based on that, seeking a remedy to that, or seeking a way out, essentially. So again, there's a lot of ways to talk about renunciation mind, but just to essentialize it, it's developing a kind of exhaustion with our samsaric state, which, as I pointed out in the last episode, is an inner state. It's not a dissociating from the world. It's not a rejection of the world. The world is coming from our perception, from a Buddhist perspective. So ultimately, we need to work with that. So I find the renunciation mind teachings to be incredibly empowering, but in the beginning, they can be a little bit tough, because they can be a little bit of a bummer, because we're looking at all different kinds of dissatisfaction, stress, and suffering, and we're looking at it in order to get more clear and sober around it in our life. And then, of course, we can then take a path to remedy it and to find or seek freedom from it. So with that said, we're going to be moving into the second of the three principal aspects of the path, which is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta actually is the entire path, so we could subsume everything into that. But in this case, Tsongkhapa is referring mostly to relative bodhicitta within this verse, and the development of loving kindness, compassion, and the altruistic wish to attain awakening for the benefit of all beings. So for those of you who haven't heard this term bodhicitta before, I'm going to unpack it a little bit. For those of you who have, we're going to talk about how to practice it. And also, how to incorporate it into your life. So we'll start with verse 6 from our text, which goes like this. Yet if this renunciation is not embraced by the pure motivation of bodhicitta, it will not become a cause for the perfect bliss of unsurpassed awakening. So the wise should generate supreme bodhicitta. Okay, so based on our previous verses, setting up what renunciation mind is and how to practice it, now we're getting into how to advance our intention or motivation for awakening, enlightenment, and or freedom, right? Inner freedom. And so he starts out here saying if renunciation mind isn't embraced by bodhicitta, it won't become a cause for full awakening. So what does he mean by that? So without getting in the weeds too much, within the various Buddhisms, we have different kinds of teachings that the Buddha gave, and various schools of Buddhism have adopted various teachings and taken those as their main path. Particularly in the philosophical systems of Tibetan Buddhism, which come from the Nalanda tradition, this great university that existed in Bihar state of India. You can go and see its ruins, but it was a huge institution for not only Buddhist learning, but also secular practices like astrology, the sciences, music, art, different things. As well as I think it was a gathering place for many, many great yogis, pandits, scholars, to grow this science of awakening, enlightenment, and how the milieu of how Dharma flourished in India, right? And so rather than how we think of this in possibly a Western dynamic where we think of like religion as this boxed in thing, and you have, this religion and then that religion, in the Indic traditions, there's a lot more crossover. Yes, there are like distinctions, but there's a lot more crossover, and these learning centers were most likely a place of a lot of intersection of various spiritual traditions. But generally, Nalanda was known as a Mahayana Buddhist university, monastic college, etc. Right? And a lot of very famous Indian scholars and great practitioners came out of Nalanda. So you'll hear that name again and again. But either way, the way Tibetan Buddhism organizes itself is based on how the Nalanda tradition taught various views on how to practice the Dharma, different interpretations of various teachings of the Buddha, as well as kind of a systemizing the teachings of the Buddha into various vehicles. We call it like, just as you would ride in a car, there's various vehicles for where you want to get with your spiritual path. And so typically we organize the path into what are called the three yanas. A yana can translate as vehicle. And these three yanas typically are the Shravakyana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, right? And so this text we're talking about is really in the Mahayana. And so the Mahayana encompasses both Shravakyana and Mahayana, because we have both the teachings and understanding of what the Buddha taught in the Pali Canon, as well as the motivation to attain liberation, to be free from samsara. But then when we talk about bodhicitta, this upgrades a little bit into the Mahayana motivation, not only to free oneself, but actually to work on one's own liberation for the benefit of all beings, in service of others, to help others also free themselves from samsaric existence. So, if you're not familiar with some of these terms or jargon, they'll be repeated a lot, and it's just one of those things. I'm introducing them because then we can learn them, and then we can start to understand what these texts are talking about and be able to practice them. For those of you familiar with these terms, hopefully we can kind of deepen some understanding here. But either way, when we're talking about bodhicitta and why he's saying renunciation mind isn't enough, because it's not enough to want to liberate oneself from samsara. We actually have to develop the altruistic wish to do that in connection with all beings, that we're doing it as a service for all beings. The importance of this starts to make sense the more we talk about it. For me personally, this is something that didn't make sense immediately. Like, I like the idea, and excuse me, of course, I trusted my teachers, so I just went with it. But over many years, this has become more clear why bodhicitta matters so much. Now, with that said, this isn't an argument between traditions of Buddhism, or putting others down or putting others up. It's really a system within Tibetan Buddhism itself, coming from the Nalanda tradition and sort of Mahayana Buddhism in India. We could also say there's not a disrespect of what we would call individual liberation, someone just seeking liberation for themselves alone. That's a valid path, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's just saying without developing bodhicitta, this greater altruistic wish, we're not going to be able to attain full enlightenment. And actually, it kind of makes sense because that's not really the path of, for instance, the Pali Canon. Like when you actually study the Pali Canon, the path of the Pali Canon is not leading to Buddhahood, it's leading to becoming an arhat, right? And so when one becomes an arhat, one's free of samsara, but one still has some ways to go to Buddhahood. And there's not even a description of how to do that necessarily. But in the Mahayana Canon, there is, right? So it's just an extension building on the teachings that are already there. I'm saying this because some people get, I don't know, they think the Mahayana teachings are putting down other teachings. It's not. It's just saying, okay, based on these other teachings and sutras of the Buddha, here's where he did teach bodhicitta and how to attain enlightenment. And then, of course, in the Vajrayana, that's not even a question. That's there, right? Well, here we're just talking between the Shravakyana and Mahayana vehicles. Anyways, if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. You can let it go. But either way, that's the context of this verse. That's why I'm talking about it. Because if renunciation mind isn't embraced by what he calls the pure motivation of bodhicitta, we won't be able to attain Buddhahood, full awakening, right? But, arhatship is no joke. I think if an arhat walked into the room where we're sitting right now or listening to this, we would be blown away, right? So again, it's not saying that's like a bad thing. It's just saying we're talking the difference between freeing oneself from samsara and becoming a Buddha, right? And again, without getting into the weeds, there's a lot of steps in between those two things. But either way, he's advising here through verse 6, okay, if you want full awakening, if you want to really go the whole way, we need to develop bodhicitta, right? So there's some other quotes from other great masters that I pulled out that also talk about this. So there's a great 19th century Tibetan Buddhist master known as Patra Rinpoche. There's some really nice biographies of his that you can read out there. And he said, if we only have one thing, the precious bodhicitta is enough. If we have nothing else, we must have the method of the precious bodhicitta. Same Shantideva said, if you stir milk, butter arises, right? So this is kind of the old school way to make butter. If you stir milk, butter arises. Likewise, if you stir the teachings, its essence, bodhi mind arises, right? So here, this is like a little bit what I was alluding to, the deeper end of what it is, because it's, on the relative level, what we call aspirational bodhicitta, we're developing a conceptual wish based on an understanding of awakening, that we wish to be free from our own afflictive emotions, namely clinging, aversion, and ignorance. We wish to do that as an inner job, as I've been saying, right? And we understand somewhat that requires the practice of shamatha and vipassana, which we're going to get into a little bit later in some of the later verses. And then we realize, okay, from this process, with this bodhicitta intention that's based on love and compassion, but it's adding on this altruistic intention, we can attain full awakening. And as you'll see, as we go through these verses on bodhicitta and then go into the third principle on emptiness, these are actually incredibly linked. So for me personally, relative bodhicitta didn't make a whole lot of sense until, some of my teachers taught a little bit more deeply on emptiness or Buddhist non-duality. And then we could see how these two things work together. We can see how, actually, unless we start to see that reality has some kind of illusory nature to it, and we start to recognize that we're experiencing some kind of a personal projection in some way. I'm not going to tell you how that is, but, we can just even see that sometimes we hear someone say something and we interpret it a certain way when they meant something else, right? Or we think, I don't know, a certain food is really good and it's not, right? So there's all kinds of examples like this. So we can see in our daily life, we're kind of running on ideas and beliefs. And so the emptiness teachings are not saying there's nothing. They're saying that things are interdependent. And when we cut through some of our illusory nature, we have more clarity also on how the relative truth exists, right? And in this case, bodhicitta, and how to be more skillful in our life as we move towards awakening. So anyways, we'll get into that in the later verses, but I just want to start to bring it up because this isn't about being a perfect person. It's about an understanding based on our Buddha nature, this sense that we are not originally screwed up or originally sinful, and based on that, all other sentient beings around us are in a similar state, meaning they have this Buddha nature, but we get confused and we move away from it. And therefore we engage in sort of activities and actions that cause, harm as well as future repercussions in the form of karma, cause, and effect that we studied in some previous episodes. And all of this is based on a misperception or sets of misperceptions. And so it's all a cause for compassion, both for ourselves, for others. And so bodhicitta is based on compassion, but then there's this element of recognizing, okay, there's a type of projection happening and we need to recognize that. And we seek, the path in order to recognize that and remedy that, but we also see all other beings mired in that and we want to see them free. And so for me, that's how bodhicitta becomes really meaningful. It's sort of like, to give an example, let's say we have a really good friend, but they just have a really bad idea, right? And by bad idea, I just mean something that is going to, cause them financial harm or harm to their health, or maybe just makes them look really bad to others, right? And we really want to help them. We're like, okay, I don't want you to go through this. I can see this is going to lead you down this path and I want to help you. But we also need to have the means and skill and kind of strength not to fall in that ourselves, right? Because if we're mired in whatever the confusion is, we're not going to be able to help others so well. I mean, minimally we can, but this is talking about leading them to awakening, right? So that's what bodhicitta is all about. And that's why in these quotes, they say it's really the essence of the teachings. So let's go on to verse 7. Verse 7 goes like this. Beings are swept along by the powerful current of the four rivers, tightly bound by the chains of their karma so difficult to undo, ensnared within the iron trap of their self-grasping, and enshrouded in the thick darkness of ignorance. So a lot more eloquently than I was putting it, Tsongkhapa is saying something similar here, right? So we have this first representation of dukkha in the form of what are traditionally called the four rivers. And just like a river, like a strong moving river, if we jumped in it would just carry us along and we wouldn't be able to get out, right? And that's what this metaphor is. So you can imagine this really strong kind of rapids and ourselves and others are stuck in that. This is another metaphor for samsara. But in this case, the four rivers are the rivers of birth, old age, sickness, and death, right? And what it means here is not just that happens within our life. It means that's recurring again and again and again and again, endlessly, until we stop the projection, essentially, until we recognize in our own minds what is true and what is not true. And then we start to change the game. We start to kind of crawl out of the river onto the shore, and then we can help others onto the shore. So it's a really nice metaphor. Now, we can get into a deep dive on why these four, right? I mean, one thing to point out here, which might be interesting for you, is when you read the Buddha's historical Buddhist biography, these are the four things he saw when he left the palace. So, he was in this palace, he was protected as a youth. His father didn't want him to become a great spiritual teacher. He wanted him to be the next king. So he kind of protected him so he wouldn't see anything. He wouldn't see people get old. He wouldn't see people suffering. He wouldn't see sickness. He wouldn't see death. But somehow, due to the Buddha's merit, he got out of the palace, right? And then there's these four experiences where he saw these four rivers happening, The birth one's a little tricky because a lot of people don't resonate with that in the West, because we generally think of birth as a good thing. But here we have to think of birth in the context of it's not that the birth is bad, it's that it's then the beginning of that particular incarnation for that being, where they have to then experience sickness, old age, and death, right? Which most of us do not like, right? Most of us would prefer to opt out of that, but we can't. Just as I said, we're kind of stuck in these four rivers. So I recommend going and reading the Buddhist biography. It's an incredible way to learn the Dharma too, and for all of this to make sense. Because if we take the Buddhist biography as something that might have happened, but also there's a lot of metaphor in there. There's a lot of wonderful teachings on the Dharma through his own life. So we can learn a lot just by reading the Buddhist biography. So that's kind of one example of how to generate the mind of enlightenment is what this verse 7 is saying, is we reflect on how ourselves and others are swept along by these powerful currents of the four rivers, next tightly bound by the chains of karma. Right, so we talked about that a little bit in a previous episode. I already gave the warning that often this can be easily misunderstood. Karma is an extremely hidden phenomena, so it's not something I guess we need to sort of accept blindly, but over time we can start to infer it more and more, the logic of it. And then we can recognize that it's a state of bondage, actually. So when we point out karma, cause, and effect as a part of the relative truth of the world and mind, we're not saying, here it is, great, that's how it is, like, deal with it. We're saying, no, like, that is created, and it's a way we're being bound, and we can actually change it. So the teachings are not negative on karma. They're actually a compassionate teaching on how to recognize subtler aspects of how we're bound to dukkha and suffering. And then, of course, we can change that. We can augment our karma, and the most importantly, we can actually cut the root of karma and completely not be bound by it anymore. That's what awakening is, essentially, is not being bound by karma, cause, and effect. So he says you're tightly bound by the chains of their karma, right? So difficult to undo, ensnared within the iron trap of self-grasping. So this is the big one. Self-grasping is the one that is the root of the poisonous plant. Poisonous here means the way we are interacting with ourselves and others, that's not working anymore. Doesn't mean we're poisonous, right? We have, our nature is awakened. But when we get confused or sort of separated from that, and we get caught in the various projections of our mind and afflictive emotions and karmic patterns, these are driven by self-grasping, this thought that I'm the most important thing in the world, that what I think, what I feel, what I do matters the most. And even if we don't believe that, like if someone asked us, we wouldn't admit to that, how are we behaving? How are we acting? And again, this isn't a cause for shame or guilt. It's a cause for recognizing the mechanism, the way of being that's getting in the way of our happiness and freedom. So from this perspective, the more self-grasping we have, the more suffering we have, right? So we'll get into that a little bit more as we get into the teachings on emptiness as well. And then, of course, he ends the verse saying, and enshrouded in the thick darkness of ignorance, which just means even this sense of self-grasping comes from a projection of who and what we think we are, right? Which is changing all the time, which isn't the same. But when we're having a moment of, I am this is me, etc., whether it's an emotion, a thought, an idea, a belief, and we cling to that, we grasp to that as self, that's where all of the other suffering proliferates from. And that itself is a form of misperception, right? Not saying you don't exist. Again, we're seeding the later teachings on emptiness here. We're going to get into that deeply in the later verses. So it's not saying we don't exist. It's just saying there's an appearance of who and what we think we are in any given moment. Obviously, it changes, but we take that so seriously. And obviously, someone calls our name and then insults us. We anger arises, or disgust, or aversion, whatever you want to think. Whatever would arise if someone would insult you. But who are they insulting? What are they insulting? Our body, some part of our speech. And we start to see, actually, when we look, we can't find that specific type of self existing in that emotion or existing in a certain part of our body. Even if we look for self within the body, where is it specifically, right? So these are the questions we'll ask later, but it doesn't mean I or you don't exist, right? That would be called nihilism, which wouldn't produce awakening. So here it's a very subtle thing, but he gets to it at the end of the verse, but it's very important because that is the root where all of the other types of suffering come from, right? So the four rivers birth, old age, sickness, and death, and everything in between, basically life, all of that comes from being tightly bound to karma, right? Ensnared in self-grasping, which then we take our afflictive emotions to be true and real, and then we create more karma, right? And then that's based on the ignorance of perceiving a truly existent or inherently existent self and other, right? And again, I'm getting into some jargon here because that's going to come later in the verses. But this is a really important understanding. If you can see this kind of, what I call is like, if you can see this kind of like stacking of how suffering and dukkha happens, we can also reverse engineer that, right? Most of us kind of stay stuck on the outer level where we just are like, wow, that's horrible. This happened. We get sick. We have a loss. The day didn't go how we want. We had an argument, whatever it is that created the stress, right? A lot of us are trying to deal on that level when actually the cause of that is underneath. So that's the compassion of these teachings here. And of course, getting to the root of it, the clinging to a truly existent or independent or inherently existent. So that takes some time and obviously meditation practice and learning. But either way, even if we have the suspicion there's something deeper going on, it's incredibly powerful because we don't just stay on the level of, what I call like the shell game of suffering, where we're just shifting one suffering for another. This is really important. I think this is kind of one of the, how do you say it, like really precious things in Buddhism is even the idea that there perhaps is a deeper issue going on, and we can understand that issue. We can see it directly in our mind with some practice and study, and we can remedy it. It's not vague. It's not like then you pray to the Buddha to like get rid of it. No, we actually need to like see it and do something about it. So it's incredibly practical. It's where we have the most agency, I would say. So I don't know. Sorry, I'm getting excited, but for me, this is like, if this clicks, the whole thing clicks. And then we become really passionate about awakening and bodhicitta. And then of course, our meditation practice can take on a whole new meaning. And of course, this is more of a marathon we're talking about, not a race. This is a lifetime of practice. But when this understanding deepens more and more, our practice will be able to take us in a more skillful direction, a direction that's really going to provide relief for ourselves and others versus just shifting around the suffering, right? So then we get into verse 8, which I think I'm going to leave for next time, but I'll just seed it a little bit and then we'll start up on it next time. So verse 8 goes like this: again and yet again, they meaning sentient beings, are reborn in limitless samsara and constantly tormented by the three forms of suffering. This is the current condition of all of your mothers from previous lives. Contemplate their plight and generate supreme bodhicitta. Okay, so verse 8 is just as, verse 7, it's connected to how to actually develop relative bodhicitta. And relative here just means a conceptual mind where we want to be free and we want all others to be free. And we're, consistently putting energy into that so that our life transforms into that purpose, right? So some people sort of ask, what is the purpose of life from a Buddhist perspective? And it depends what vehicle you ask, because some vehicles, there wouldn't be a purpose, right? Because life itself is a type of confusion that we need to remedy, right? And most people don't like that answer. It's not like the greatest news. But from the Mahayana perspective, I feel there's a purpose in developing bodhicitta. The purpose is to live with bodhicitta, to work with bodhicitta, as one of my root teachers, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, used to say, to basically bring everything one does throughout the day into the practice of bodhicitta. And here he's referring to relative bodhicitta because it's a conceptual process where we're developing closeness to others via love. We're developing, opening our hearts more to others via compassion. And then via bodhicitta and this altruistic wish, we're developing the wish and aspiration to free them from suffering. And of course, that's connected to our own, because how are we going to free anyone from any of this samsaric business if we don't have some freedom from that, at least a little, right? So We'll get into verse 8 next time. I just wanted to seed it a little bit. That's what we'll talk a little bit about, where we'll talk a little bit more about actually practicing it. But I would recommend, like, think about these things, especially reflect on between now and the next episode on this. Think about these different, I guess you could say, going from gross to subtle, of how we end up in confusion and how we end up mired in stress, dissatisfaction, suffering, etc. In verse 8, he does mention the 3 types of suffering, so I'll go into that next time, and that'll talk more about like the specifics of suffering. Normally, normally they say the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering. I did speak about that a little bit in a past episode, but we'll go into more detail. And again, just a reminder before we close, whenever we talk about dukkha or suffering or dissatisfaction or whatever, we're not talking about it to, this is my perspective, we're not talking about it to sort of bring, to sort of bring us down or to create a bummer. We're actually pointing out where the problem is, because then we can remedy it. If there was no remedy, there's no point in pointing it out. I think that's kind of cruel, right? Because you just tell someone, okay, there's this incredibly terrible thing that you can do nothing about. That's not a kind thing. But in this case, that's not the case. It's being pointed out, and we need to reflect on it and deepen our relationship to that, seeing it more and more in our mind and life, because it fuels our wish to change it, to remedy it, to, get out of those stages of clinging, aversion, ignorance, right? So anyways, I'll just leave it there, because otherwise maybe this will become too long. So thanks so much. I really appreciate you listening or watching to this. And yeah, take care. See you on the next one.